Hello, everybody. My name is John Gfroerer, and I come from up in Concord, New Hampshire. It's nice to see you, and it's nice to be here. It's the first time I've ever been in this building, other than 2 days ago when I came to check it out. So a little bit about this documentary. I should say one thing that I was listening to the radio on the way down. And does anybody know what today is? Today's is a recognized holiday. Man, you people in the Musical Association should know this. Today is Piano Day. And the reason it's Piano Day is because it's the 88th day of the year. So put that in your bucket. So I don't know if you planned that when you wanted to do a documentary or just show this piece about Amy Beach, but nevertheless, that's today. So just a very quick...
Talk a little closer to the mic.
Talk a little closer to the mic. All right. I won't tell the piano story again. So what we'll do is I'll just give a real quick introduction to the documentary. We'll show it. It runs about an hour and 15 minutes, and you will all be properly educated. And then we'll talk a little bit about it afterwards. If we got some questions or comments, and maybe we'll get Virginia over here to play a little on the piano.
Her last name.
Virginia?
Yeah.
Virginia Eskin?
Yeah.
Oh.
Is she here tonight?
Yes, Virginia Eskin is here.
Wow.
If it hadn't been Virginia Eskin, this documentary would not have happened. And just to kind of give a quick synopsis of how that happened, I have, being somebody who lives in New Hampshire and has always had an interest in history and has done other historical documentaries, Amy Beach has always been in the back of my mind as someday it'd be fun to do a documentary about Amy Beach. But it's one of those things that just, wasn't as much excitement about it as other things that I had done. Well, I don't know if you remember up in New Hampshire years ago, there was a publisher by the name of William Lowe. Quite an odious fellow. He used to write the Union Leader. He's the publisher of the Union Leader. He's the guy that made Muskie cry. Well, I had done a documentary about William Lowe, and we were showing that over in Keene, New Hampshire. And when it was all over, this woman comes up to me and says, "Have you ever thought about doing a documentary about Amy Beach?" Well, that was Virginia. And Virginia just unloaded on me. That's the only way to explain it. I felt like I was a piano and I was getting played. So we kind of talked about it real briefly, and then we just kind of let it be. And that was the 2016 election, so we were all getting comfortable with our new president. And about 6 months into that, I gave her a call, and we met in Henniker, and that's where Amy was born. And we met in Henniker and had lunch, and Virginia gave me the test to see if I was up to doing her stuff. And we just continued for about a year just talking about it. And then from that we said, well, if we're going to talk about it, let's see if we can raise some money for it. And we got a little bit of money for it. And then we started, 3 years ago, we started recording, 2019, 3 years ago. So that's the story of how this documentary came together. It was my skill as an editor and a producer, and Virginia's skill with having lots of contacts, because these are people that I could not have gotten to sit down with me if they didn't have Virginia as the contact to reach out to them originally. So anyway, that's the story of the documentary, and now we'll sit back and watch the documentary and hear the story of Amy Beach.
I got a phone call in 1985 from an organization in San Francisco called the Women's Philharmonic, asking if I would come out and conduct a concert of all women composers. I was kind of flummoxed because I said to them, I'm embarrassed to say this, but I said to them, what women composers?
She was clearly very gifted at taking a concept, be it a concept in a poem, or a concept or an idea that is in a liturgical text, in a hymn, or even a theological one. She could take those ideas and create an extraordinary musical fabric to really bring that to light and to enable you to hear those words in a way that was unique to that experience with fresh ears. That's the mark of a great artist, truly.
The first word that comes to mind is earnest. earnest because I'm thinking of the melodies that she gives us. And they're so, from my way of thinking, they're so from the heart.
Amy Marcy Cheney was born September 5, 1867, here on Western Avenue in Henniker, New Hampshire, the first and only child of Charles and Clara Cheney. Her father, Charles, worked at a paper mill 2 miles up the Contoocook River from their home, which he owned with his father, Moses. Clara Cheney took care of the house, was active in their church and church choir, and taught piano to local students.
By the time she was 1 year old, before she could say a word, she could hum at least 40 tunes in the key that she had originally heard them in.
Amy's intelligence and musical talent was evident at an early age, but the Cheney family followed a strict fundamentalist spirituality and raised Amy guided by those teachings.
There was a popular child-rearing philosophy that children should be sort of kept from things that they really want to do in order to instill a sense of working very hard, of like wanting something a lot. It was obviously identified pretty early that Amy Beach loved music the most, and that what she really wanted to do was play the piano, because her mother played the piano and she saw her mother playing the piano and she loved it so much. So she was intentionally kept from playing the piano.
You know, the mother was so punishing and didn't allow her to go to the piano. What a terrible thing to do to a 2 or 3 year old who wants to be expressive.
She would sit on the stairs and pretend it was a piano and play on the stairs. And then finally, I think when she was 4, they let her at the instrument.
Once allowed at the piano, Amy embraced it with a passion and skill far beyond her young age. She was extremely sensitive to sounds, especially loud sounds like thunder, laughter, shouting, even raindrops. And music played in minor keys would bring her to tears.
She was also synesthetic, which meant that when she heard music in a particular key, she saw a certain color. So there were some keys that were red, and there were some keys that were black, and there were some keys that were blue.
Though Amy was now allowed to play the piano, her parents continued to control her time at the keyboard, following the philosophy that by denying it, they would increase their daughter's determination to play. They also used Amy's musical sensitivity to control her behavior.
Her mother would actually used it as a punishment to play music differently. It would upset Amy so much that it was a disciplinary tool that they used.
Her intelligence went beyond music. By the time she was 3 years old, she knew the alphabet and was reading. But music was her foremost passion, and her talent for composing appeared at an early age.
When Beach is 2 and 3, she's writing pretty advanced pieces, Mama's Waltz.
She was such a prodigy, and she was somebody who was really thinking through the technicalities of music and how pitches relate to each other, how music sounded, how chords and intervals sounded.
In 1871, her father's paper mill burned down. Charles was offered a position with a paper company in Boston, and the family moved to Chelsea, Massachusetts, bringing Amy closer to the resources and people that could help advance a musical gift. Her mother continued to oversee and guide every aspect of Amy's education, homeschooling her daughter in reading and writing. Most importantly, Clara controlled Amy's development at the piano. She didn't want Amy to become an exploited child prodigy. She wanted her daughter to become a musician, and she understood that Boston was a place where this could happen.
She got a piano teacher. She was able to go to concerts, and she was able to play a little bit here and there for folks in Boston. So she started to gain something of a reputation as a prodigy. She also started more and more to gain access to Boston's communities, Boston's musical infrastructures.
Boston was such a nurturing place for musicians and composers, and she was caught up in all the frenzy of musical activity that was taking place here with all the other Boston composers at the same time.
Many of the most prominent composers in the United States at the time were centered in Boston, and along with some of the most well-funded and best musical institutions.
Europe was the world center of musical culture in the 19th century. Vienna, Paris, Salzburg were home to Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, Schumann, and many more. Meanwhile, America at that time, still staggering in the aftermath of a civil war, didn't even have a full-time symphony orchestra. But in the later half of the century, Boston began to emerge and seize the mantle of America's cultural center, with musical organizations like the Handel and Haydn Society, art galleries, and educational institutions such as Harvard and MIT. Boston began to see and promote itself as the Athens of America. This was the cultural dynamic of the place that young Amy Marcy Cheney was experiencing and becoming a part of.
There had been a series of orchestras in Boston that had attempted to get established. None of them was sufficiently funded to last more than a couple of years, and they couldn't afford to pay the players for rehearsals very much, and so the quality never developed very far.
It was Henry Lee Higginson, our founder and sustainer, who fulfilled his lifelong dream of founding a permanent orchestra in his hometown of Boston, modeled on the great orchestras of Europe that he had heard while he was a student.
Which would be the first time an orchestra would be established, not only in Boston, but throughout the USA, to have a full season, as we consider it today. Major orchestras perform essentially every week with breaks in between. And the first year, I believe they had 24 concerts in the subscription series. And the idea was there would be a set makeup of the players. They would rehearse together consistently and therefore improve their abilities. In the context of just fitting together, working together, balancing, getting a blend, and all of those things. And at that time, there was no orchestra in America that had anything like that. I think it worked in Boston because of the Boston culture.
Undergirding all of that was the Brahmin sort of aristocracy, that there was a community of very wealthy folks in Boston, sometimes very closed, sometimes very socially exclusive.
Being from a small family, from a small town in New Hampshire, now living in Chelsea under modest means, was not the ticket to becoming part of exclusive Boston's society or gaining the access and privilege that society presented. But a gift of musical talent could be a spark that could draw recognition. Amy Cheney had that spark and a talent that gained notice.
You know, the piano and the violin were the two instruments that women were allowed to learn. They were considered appropriate to women, and you could become a virtuoso on those instruments and even have a career, presumably if you didn't marry.
The recommended course would have been for Amy to advance her piano studies in Europe, but Clara was not interested in sending her only daughter off to study across the ocean. Amy would be taught by Boston piano teachers. Still, her talent at the keyboard excelled even without European guidance. She began to gain a reputation and a following as a small circle of Bostonians caught up with local pride monitored and championed her progress.
She started to perform a little bit here and there in Boston. And so folks around Boston started to sort of become more aware of this very young female piano prodigy that was growing up in their town.
Among those who supported this young pianist was poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who, after hearing her play, gave her permission to set one of his poems to music.
She's allowed to use Longfellow's poem, The Rainy Day, and it has that theme. Where'd she get that? Well, the Pathetique Sonata of Beethoven, not a bad thing to copy.
The day is cold and dark and dreary. It rains and the wind is never weary. The vine still clings to the moldering wall, but at every ghost the dead leaves fall, and the day is dark and dreary.
The Rainy Day, written in 1883, became Amy's first published musical composition. Later that year, in October, 16-year-old Amy made her formal Boston debut at the piano in the Boston Music Hall, performing Moscheles' G minor concerto with an orchestra and Chopin's Rondo in E-flat for solo piano. The performance expanded Amy's growing reputation as a gifted Boston pianist that the city could be proud of. On March 28, 1885, 17-year-old Amy Chaney had her debut with Boston's newest orchestra, the Boston Symphony, then only in its fourth season. She performed the Piano Concerto No. 2 in F minor by Frédéric Chopin.
Even now, it's very unusual to have a teenage performer as a concerto soloist in a professional orchestra, but it was probably all but unheard of at that time.
It's important to understand that here's a sort of a couple who are from the middle class, who were rather humble in their own means, who had this piano prodigy who was all of a sudden quite well known in Boston's elite circles. And there was a dynamic there that Clara was trying to navigate for the family's benefit, but also for Amy's benefit as well.
On December 2nd, 1885, at Trinity Church in Boston, Amy Marcy Chaney married Dr. Henry Harris Aubrey Beach, a prominent Boston physician who loved music and dabbled in writing poetry. At 42 years of age, he was 24 years older than Amy, who at the time of their marriage was only 18. Still just a teenager, Amy moved from her parents' house into her husband's home at 28 Commonwealth Avenue, where servants were on call to take care of her every need.
The instinct of teenage rebellion is ubiquitous whenever you're born, whether or not you can act it out. And I don't think that was ever realized with her. So she goes from mom to husband. So she's, there's never a point there where she's on her own.
When Amy got married to Henry Beach, it was a mark of arrival, certainly, into the Brahmin class. It meant something very important for her, for her family. It meant something about her class standing, her social standing in Boston society.
I think they both got something out of the marriage. He was a music lover, and I think he loved being surrounded by her music. And she got all the support.
It also meant something in terms of her public image that she became Mrs. HHA Beach, that she became a married woman. Unmarried women touring around and concertizing were frequently met with some suspicion. Particularly because she was now married to a very wealthy Bostonian, it was unseemly for her to accept payment for concertizing in particular.
Amy's marriage put an end to any possible career as a concert pianist. Her husband, deferring to societal norms of the day, didn't think it appropriate to have his young wife touring the country, giving concerts, spending nights away in hotel rooms, earning money. He needed to be the perceived primary source of income and support for his family. For the duration of their marriage, Amy's public performances were limited, and any fees she received were donated.
And then she writes a song called Ariette, and she asks the pianist, it's in the music, it's early, it's opus 1. It's so beautiful, it says, make the piano sound like the strumming of a guitar.
Denied the very thing which defined her identity and reputation in the eyes of the Boston public, Amy Beach turned to composing. Her first compositions were created when she was just 4 years old, and in the intervening years, she wrote songs and a few small piano works. But composing had always taken second place to performing. Now it would become her primary identity and occupation.
In any discipline, science, medicine, navigation, you need proper education. And she never has that sort of bulwark template laid down.
In the long list of her compositions, it's worth noting that Opus 1 is dated 1885, the year of her marriage. And while she had trained as a pianist, she was not trained in the art of musical composition.
There were a lot of discussions about what was appropriate for Amy to do in order to learn how to compose. One option that was the most frequent option for people who were as successful as Amy was to go to Europe and to study in German conservatories. And that door was closed pretty quickly, probably on account of her gender, that she wouldn't have been allowed to study in German in a composition class in Germany anyway, because women were allowed to take part in performing classes. They were allowed to learn how to perform, but in most German conservatories, they weren't allowed to study composition anyway.
And there was at that time a very odd sort of philosophy among men, and that women's talent might be destroyed by too much study. In other words, what a woman did well, she did well instinctively, and leave that alone. You know, don't mess around with that because it's a fragile gift.
Louis Elson discussed her in terms of biological destiny. What were the capacities of women's brains? Could they compose? Not did they compose, but could, should, and would. So could they compose has to do with biological theories that we need to relate to the race theories in America at the time. Because just as women were stereotyped through limited understanding of biology and its intersections with culture, so theories about race and what it meant to be Negro were predominant in the United States, and there were just as many theories about the inferiority of Black people as there were about the innate inferiority of women.
So the idea was that male students could undergo rigorous conservatory training in composition, but they were strong enough to maintain their own sense of creativity and their own voice. Women, being assumed to be weaker, would lose their creative voice.
Denied an education in any aspect of composing, Amy Beach set about to teach herself. Her first published pieces were songs and works for solo piano, including an extensive cadenza for Beethoven's Third Piano Concerto, which she performed with the Boston Symphony in 1888.
She would memorize full orchestral scores of entire symphonies that took sometimes 30 minutes, 45 minutes to be performed, up to some symphonies were over an hour. She would study them, she would memorize them, she would copy them out from memory, and then if the Boston Symphony was performing it, she would do all of that, and then she would take her copy of a score that she had copied out from memory to the concert and study that score as the symphony was playing it to check her mistakes.
But she was able to understand those scores from a composing point of view.
In 1889, when she was just 22 years old, Amy published her Opus 5, a mass set for chorus, quartet, organ, and orchestra. It was premiered by Boston's Handel and Haydn Society on February 7, 1892. At the conclusion of this 70-minute piece, Beach received a royal ovation and was overwhelmed with flowers. The Mass established her as a rising composer, not only in Boston, but in all America. One reviewer struggled to explain how Beach was able to rise so far above her limitations as a woman. However, suffragette leader Julia Ward Howe said, "The Mass made evident the capacity of a woman's brain to plan and execute a work combining great seriousness with unquestionable beauty." Though never embracing the politics of women marching for the right to vote, Amy Beach became a symbol of the creative power of women.
There was a World's Fair in Chicago in the 1890s, in which she was brought in as a real example, specifically for American women, of the sort of progress that American women were making. And her work was upheld as this shining beacon of American accomplishment.
In 1892, Beach was commissioned to compose a piece for the opening of the Women's Pavilion at the Chicago World's Fair. In just 6 weeks, she wrote Festival Jubilate, a piece for chorus and orchestra. Originally planned to be presented with a choir of 5,000 voices, money and gender bias caused them to scale down to an orchestra with a 300-voice choir. The fair director commented that, as a woman composer, Beach was very good, but of ordinary merit as compared to men.
One of the benefits of being married is that she had servants to take care of the housework, and in fact, Amy's mother had not prepared her to take care of her own household. So there are these stories about when she first got married, about faux pas that Amy Beach committed. Like there were plates that were given to them, ornamental plates that were given to them as a wedding gift, that she, in the early days of marriage, had the servants take down off the wall and put on the tables to serve the food on.
Marriage dramatically altered Beach's career path as a pianist, but opened up an ideal situation for a composer. She didn't need to worry about money or even domestic chores. Hired servants took care of her needs, from cleaning to cooking, allowing her life to be focused on composing music. Like the piano, composition came to her naturally. She was taken on by a publisher, Arthur P. Schmidt, who began publishing her songs and sending them around the country. And her husband, Henry, encouraged this pursuit, even writing poetry that Amy would set to music. While most of her compositions were for solo piano or songs or pieces for small ensembles, Henry encouraged Amy to take on larger works as well, such as the Mass. He also suggested she try writing a symphony.
I think it says a lot that a 23-year-old Amy Beach decided to embark on writing a symphony, that she is a really bold thing.
A symphony is the mark of a great composer. Beethoven, Mozart, Brahms, Schubert, Dvorak, nearly all the 19th century composers known today secured their place in musical history by writing symphonies.
The big difference, of course, with those people is they were men who were able to go and studied all their lives with professional composers, went to Europe, studied with the greatest European teachers. I contrasted it with Amy Beach, self-taught, because no one really thought it was going to amount to much to teach a woman, so they didn't. And her piece remains, for me, the greatest of all of those. There's a kind of freshness to it. There's a sort of passion and strength that she taught herself.
Good. Yeah, so this is where we've arrived, okay? And somebody heroic is over here and over here. Amidst all this tumult. And we have these 4-bar phrases that we'd like to really layer on top and really respond as we go, as we build this portrait.
She knows how to add instruments to change colors, but also how to add them to create intensity. And intense is a word I would use for the symphony. It's very intense. In that first movement, she did what the German masters felt you needed to do. When someone comes in to hear a symphony, you've got to get them right at the beginning. You've got to take them on this journey. So what's happening? You hear something rumbling and you want to follow it.
In writing a symphony, she was trying to, make a statement about her own compositional prowess, that she was able to take on a genre like that.
And we're told nobody knew how to write American music in those days. They were all copying Brahms and Schumann and so on, which they were doing because that was the model. Their sense of the greatest music being written in state was Beethoven, Schubert, Schumann, Brahms. Even Tchaikovsky came along in there, Strauss later on. And of course, they were inspired by those people, and so they wrote music that was closely modeled, not copied, but modeled in style and approach to those pieces.
That's really the beginning of American music. It's the beginning of an established American cultural life. The Boston Symphony was just formed. Our composers are starting to think of themselves as Americans rather than copying Robert Schumann. They're starting to begin to understand that they need to reflect who they are and where they are. And of course there was the influence of Dvorak.
Antonin Dvorak was brought to the United States with an express mandate to foster an American symphonic tradition, an American symphonic style. He decided eventually that the way forward for an American national style, much like he had himself already done in Bohemia, in Prague, was to use traditional tunes and to apply them to symphonic writing. The question in the United States is, what traditional music would one use?
African American music of the slaves, music of the indigenous peoples of the region.
Italians, Swedes, Russians, And of course, the Irish, it being in Boston, which was a locus for Irish immigration to the United States and had been for 50 years.
So she thought, well, I can write a piece based upon Irish traditions, Gaelic traditions, that I can use. And that was the genesis for this piece.
It's a quarter note, an eighth note, a quarter note, and an eighth note, where it has this kind of gentle pulsing that maybe is rocking, but it has that lilt and that moves things along in a very natural way.
It starts out in strings and then it goes to the woodwinds. That to me is the most magical moment. The strings start out and then all of a sudden it's like, let them sing on their own. If you were going to do a scherzo in a symphony, you started right out with a fast tempo. She doesn't. She gives you, she sort of tricks you a little bit. She tricks you into thinking, oh, this is the slow movement. That's the way it should be. The second movement is the slow movement. No, because she gives you this beautiful introduction. Woodwinds, her treatment of woodwinds is exquisite, really exquisite. And maybe she had a certain interest in them, and that's why she uses them individually for solos. And then somehow this beautiful introduction ends, and this kind of she only has three pianos, bump, bump, bump. But I decided in one performance, and I liked it, bump, bump, bump. You know, this feeling of, boop, it disappears.
This is a fully professional piece of work that was written at a time when most of us didn't think there was any professional music going on in America. That is simply our ignorance.
The Gaelic Symphony was opus number 32 in Beach's growing catalogue of works. Still not yet 30 years old, her music was becoming recognized and performed around the country and around the world. Compositions included sacred music, such as her Mass, solo works for piano, hymns, and over 24 songs. One song, Ecstasy, became so popular that the royalties enabled her to purchase a parcel of land in Centerville on Cape Cod. She and Henry built a small cottage on the site, which became their getaway. Beach said, "We wanted to live in a tent, but the piano couldn't, so we built a cottage around the piano." Situated on a small pond, surrounded by woods and near the ocean, this was the place where they could relax, work, and be together away from city life. They named their place on the Cape the Pines.
Amy Beach was born into a society where home music making was something that was valued in women. I think there's a reason why people love her songs in particular as much as they do, and her solo piano music.
In 1897 and 1898, Beach published an album of children's piano pieces, a set of pieces for violin and piano, and 17 songs, including 3 set to poems by Robert Browning, and 3 set to the words of William Shakespeare.
As light as bird from briar, and this city after me.
There are these 4 solo lines, and the challenge is that the range is extremely large. And so you have to be able to sing a low G and then a high E and C sharp, and all within like 8 measures. And then do a smooth crescendo and phrase it and express the lyrics and connect with each other. So there are lots of challenges. Amy Beach's music really it's a solo line times 4. And then you're also, in that solo line, first of all, you have the responsibility to bring out your own line. And then you have the responsibility to do chamber music. So you're connecting with the other musicians, which is incredibly difficult. You have to have trust, vulnerability in order to connect. And only if we trust each other can we then break down the walls of insecurity and really make meaningful music. Let's do the crescendo towards the end, and we're gonna sing and dance. And can you, similar to what we did with the first, what if you were children, how would you express the words sing and dance?
Sing and dance.
The piano concerto is just, the theme of it is, it's just a C sharp minor scale. So is, you know, the New World Symphony.
Beach's next major composition would be a piano concerto. Its premiere performance was on April 6, 1900, with the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Amy was at the keyboard.
Can you imagine what it would be like to be a woman composer, getting to be the soloist in the world premiere performance of your own piano concerto with the Boston Symphony Orchestra?
Listen up.
The concerto is massively creative. 4 movements. The second one, as you say, the perpetuum, is just a nightmare. This. And that goes on, that never stops. It's called perpetuum mobile because it never stops. And underneath that is this. And that's Empress of Night, which was a song of hers.
She threw in thirds and octaves and sixths. It's like a nightmare. It's like every Chopin etude in that movement.
That is one dangerous movement to play. It is scary. That is really scary. It's sort of like meet you at the finish line, meet you at the end. That's what we always say to each other, meet you at the end.
One quality of Beach's music that I prize is the very fact that it's not as polished and as predictable as that of some other contemporaries of hers. There's something fresh and ingenuous about her ability to just throw herself into these large forms like her concerto or her symphony and not fret too much whether or not the motivic development was perfectly in place or whether or not the thematic structure was perfectly balanced. In a way, it reminds me of Charles Ives, who similarly lacked training on European soil and also has been accused of needing a good editor. Well, maybe that has pluses and minuses about it. Sometimes editors make us more polished, but sometimes they make too many rough places plain.
The Piano Concerto was the last major orchestral piece by Amy Beach. Over the next decade, she produced a few large-scale pieces for orchestra and chorus, such as the chambered Nautilus, but the bulk of her output were songs, small ensemble pieces, and works for solo piano.
She certainly loved Henry. She was very close with Henry. All of her writings suggest that it was a very close relationship that the two of them had.
In April 1910, Dr. Beach was making a house call when he took a wrong turn in the dark and fell down a flight of stairs, causing serious injury. While recovery was expected, complications arose. He died in his Commonwealth Avenue home on June 28th. Amy had little time to fully mourn the loss. Her mother was also ill. Clara had been living in the Commonwealth Avenue home with Amy and Henry since Amy's father died in 1896. After Henry's death, Amy shifted her focus to caring for her mother. Because of the stairs at Commonwealth Avenue, they moved into the Brunswick Hotel 2 blocks away. The following January, Clara Cheney died. In less than a year, the two most important people in her life were gone. At 42 years of age, Amy Cheney Beach needed to begin building a new life for herself.
And she wrote the Prelude and Fugue based on A, B, E, A, C, H, H being B natural in German, right after he died. It's in A minor, and it has this A pedal tone, so it starts. And then it goes on, but then she does this theme with the A. The A, and I keep hearing that as, I'm Amy, I'm not Mrs. H.H.A. Beach. The whole thing is based on A. And even when she does the actual fugue, that's the prelude, but the fugue is A, B, E, A, C, A. Yeah. I think she's saying, I want to be known as Amy, and I think she's grabbing her identity back at this point, because this is written in 1912, and it's right after he died.
Major changes to Beach's life came quickly. She suddenly found herself needing to take charge of her finances, her house, and her future. 3 months after Henry died, she decided to be baptized and joined Emmanuel Episcopal Church, which was directly behind their house on Commonwealth Avenue. She started thinking about traveling abroad, something she had never done. And she began thinking about resuming her career as a concert pianist.
The idea that one doesn't perform for a couple of decades and then all of a sudden is ready for the concert stage again. That takes tremendous bravery.
Beach set sail for Europe with a friend in September 1911. Her first European concert performance was given at the end of October in Dresden. She would spend the next 3 years traveling between Germany, France, and Italy, meeting new friends, performing, composing, and enjoying the musical culture of Europe that had been denied her up until that moment. It would take a world war to pry her from Europe and bring her back to the United States. And even that didn't happen instantly. The outbreak of the war in July 1914 forced her to cancel a planned European concert tour. But still, she insisted on remaining in Munich, where she volunteered with the Red Cross, and regularly saw German troops marching off to battle. Finally, in September, she decided to return home to the United States. Amy Beach's return to the United States was at a time of radical change in the world, in society, and in the arts. World War was about to expose new horrors and weapons, destroy old orders and old ways. The world as it was known felt to many out of control. New inventions such as automobiles, airplanes, motion pictures, and sound recording were taking root and about to revolutionize every aspect of society. Women were marching in the streets, demanding the right to vote, and America, though not in the war at the beginning, was expecting to take its place on the world stage. Artists such as Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse, shown for the first time in 1913 at New York's Armory Show, challenged and changed the definition of visual arts. And young composers such as Arnold Schoenberg, Claude Debussy, and Igor Stravinsky were creating new sounds, vibrant with a bold, modern energy never before heard, such as Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, which had its premiere in May 1913 in Paris.
They had to make a career for themselves. And the way they do it is say, well, we're the up-and-coming modern style. Those folks back there are very old-fashioned, and their music, we don't need to listen to that anymore.
By the time Munch and Koussevitzky are the major conductors in Boston, they are actually looking to Russian, Jewish, French. They're not going to help a dumpy American woman. And all those American composers are thrown away.
Times had changed so drastically that the music before the turn of the century was just passé.
She's forgotten. She's forgotten because she's not interested in ragtime or jazz.
Schoenberg and Bartók and all the more modern music coming along was the way that you had to write if you wanted to be a contemporary composer.
She lived into the 1940s. And so she lived through the modernist turn and the rise of serialism and atonality. And I think that she struggled to find her place in that. I think that she had such an ear for music, and she grew up learning the diatonic system, and it was hard for her to give up on that. So I don't think she ever fully bought into the modernist turn.
As change was happening in the world of music, diminishing her popularity, so too was it happening in Amy Beach's personal life. Upon her return to the United States, she moved back into the home on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston. But perhaps the house felt empty without her husband, or maybe it had too many memories. Even Boston, where she had lived nearly all her life, no longer felt like where she wanted to be. In February 1915, Amy left the Commonwealth Avenue house and moved to New York City. She would never again live in Boston.
There's a tremendous sense of history when you enter the building to know that this is where somebody like Amy Beach came and offered up her prayer, and more so, offered up her works as prayer on behalf of everybody here gathered.
In New York, Beach found not only a vibrant cultural life, but also a spiritual base at St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church on Park Avenue in Midtown Manhattan. She developed a close relationship with its choir master, David McKay Williams, who often used her sacred music compositions in services.
I think she was torn in her heart a lot. I think she was longing in her heart a lot. There's a lot of longing. The long line, the keeping the line going, I think is longing. I think she was longing. I'm not sure I know what she was longing for.
Even the move to New York did not quiet the disruptions in Beach's life. The next few years would bring more changes and personal loss. Her compositional output fell and leaned more towards spiritually based music. She moved for a brief time to San Francisco to live with her Aunt Frank and cousin Ethel, even registering to vote for the first time. But before Election Day came around, she, her aunt, and cousin abruptly moved back east to Hillsborough, New Hampshire. In 1917, the United States became a combatant in World War I. Beach spent this time in Hillsborough, helping in the war effort by volunteering with the local Red Cross. She also devoted herself to caring for her cousin Ethel, who had become sick with a terminal illness. Beach canceled concert engagements, and even her composing seems to have been curtailed. Ethel passed away in April 1920. Beach later said that after her cousin's death, she felt as if the song had left her heart. In June 1921, Beach settled into a residency at the McDowell Colony in Peterborough, New Hampshire. The artist retreat had been founded just a few years earlier by Marion McDowell, the widow of composer Edward McDowell.
Well, certainly Mrs. McDowell and Amy Beach were of the same era, and neither of them followed the guidelines that were laid down for them. They defied the expectations of a very gendered social doctrine of the time. And they did it on their own terms.
The colony offered a place for artists to focus deeper into their art, and for Beach it also became a place to find solace from the difficult years just past. To other colonists, she wanted to be known as Aunt Amy, and when not in her studio, she could be found organizing an afternoon game of croquet or an evening game of pocket billiards. She also offered herself to mentor other composers in residence. Over the next 20 years, Amy Beach would spend part of every summer at the Colony. Here in the Watson studio, she began composing anew. She again found that song in her heart.
Being in residence compresses a great deal of creative work into a short expanse of time. One of the most common comments that artists will note in their departure from MacDowell is that, oh, I got 6 months of work done in 3.5 weeks.
In the 5 years after her first stay at MacDowell, Beach published nearly 30 new works, more than the output of the previous 10 years. Almost all this music was written or sketched out at MacDowell.
Amy Beach found out who she was by composing in that late 19th century style that understood the possibilities inherent in every sound experience that filled her world. She once said, "I live in the woods." And I think that's what I love about some of her music, that is so naturally grounded in experience.
So the bird song is in the beginning, all those little things. But then what she does in the middle part, she puts a regular piano piece. So it, trundles along. It's very, very beautiful. And then she pulls it back after all of those, beautiful harmonies. That's the morn, and here's the thrush at eve. So if the morn thrush is that, she says the thrush at eve, she puts it that was in D minor, which is kind of like an opaque key, but then the thrush at eve, she puts in E flat minor, which is very darker.
Beach's life took on a seasonal routine. Between concert engagements around the country, she would spend winter in Hillsborough, June or September or both at MacDowell, and summer in Centerville at the Pines. Beach did no cooking or housekeeping and hired people to take on these chores at each location except MacDowell. And she never learned to drive, so she was always in need of drivers to get her from place to place. Though her popularity had been overshadowed by new and more modern musical sounds and composers, that did not diminish her compositional spirit or output. Every year there were new additions to her catalog, from art songs to solo piano works and large-scale works such as a short opera and the Canticle of the Sun, written for chorus and orchestra. she also began experimenting with new sounds herself, such as the hermit thrush pieces.
I do think that her later music reflects some experimentation with new harmonic possibilities, new textural possibilities. From my perspective, that meant looking towards the musical language of early French modernists, sort of new harmonic sounds, but not fully letting go of the diatonic system.
It opens with this open fifth, and then it evolves with, it's kind of a lilting melody, bum, ba-dum, bum, throughout. And the instruments all weave that same rhythmic motif.
In addition to composing, Beach continued touring and performing, including 2 more trips to Europe. Always eager to nurture new talent, she was a co-founder and the first president of the Society of American Women Composers. In addition to concert halls, she appeared regularly on radio broadcasts, performing and offering her commentary on the world of musical composition, as well as writing regularly for music magazines such as Etude. In 1930, she again moved to New York City and continued her relationship with St. Bartholomew's Church.
Amy Beach's sacred choral music spans a number of different ranges. It spans a range in terms of style, where some of it is actually quite conservative and very plain and prayerful and introspective. And then there are other pieces that, let's say, harmonically are very Wagnerian or adventurous.
Amy Beach once wrote, "The true mission of music is to uplift. Beyond the earthly lies the spiritual world. To me, the greatest function of all creative art is to bring even a little of the eternal into the temporal life." In 1934, Beach made her last extended concert tour. At 67, she was starting to slow down. She still performed, but they were single concert appearances, including 2 at the White House, where she and soprano Ruth Schaffner presented programs of her songs for President and Mrs. Roosevelt. As health concerns increased, her composing began to decrease. Her last major piece was a trio for piano, violin, and cello, composed in just 15 days while at MacDowell in 1938. On March 19, 1940, Beach was at the keyboard performing the piano trio at the neighborhood club in Brooklyn. 3 days later, she became seriously ill with bronchitis and soon after was diagnosed with a severe heart condition. The Brooklyn recital was her last public performance. By year's end, she was told by her doctor that she should no longer play the piano. In June 1941, Beach wrote, "I have taken no formal farewell from public performances, nor do I intend to do so. But I face the fact that I shall never again be strong enough for it." In the spring of 1941, she went to Hillsborough, then to McDowell. But soon after leaving McDowell, she became ill again. She was forced to slow down even more. From that point on, her life was divided between Centerville, Cape Cod, and New York. In 1942, she published her last composition. Based upon an earlier work for piano, it was a prelude, written for the organ at St. Bartholomew's.
In its piano form, it is magnificently idiomatic, late Romantic pianism in its textures, in the way that she approaches the instrument, in the way that she makes magic out of that instrument. And the organ piece, although it uses some of the same material, is a completely different piece in that it is utterly idiomatic to the pipe organ. And it goes further than that, further than merely being idiomatic. It really explores all the possibilities of the instrument in a piece that comes across as being kind of straightforward in its surface, but despite that, it explores so many colors and textures and a wonderful harmonic range.
On November 6, 1944, in her suite at the Hotel Barclay in New York, just a block away from St. Bartholomew's, Beach wrote in her diary, "Not feeling well, hip aches." It would be her last entry. 5 days later, she was confined to bed. Over the next few weeks, there was a steady stream of visitors and phone calls from Beach's many friends around the country. One reported that Beach was sitting up in her bed, wearing a pink jacket, surrounded by flowers, and asked the visitor to give everyone her love, her very dear love.
She was just very passionate, and she was very passionate about music, but she also really intensely loved people.
As Christmas approached, Beach slipped into a coma. With her dear friend Ruth Schaffner sitting at her side, holding her hand, Amy Beach died of heart disease, December 27, 1944. Her ashes were held at St. Bartholomew's until they could be sent to Boston for burial in Forest Hills Cemetery, next to her mother, father, and her husband, Dr. HMA Beach.
I'd like to quote another historian now, John Tasker Howard, who knew Mrs. HMA Beach, called her Mrs. Beach, and he interviewed her, I think around 1929, and this is what he had to say. "I once asked Mrs. Beach if she ever resented being called an American composer. No, she answered, but I would rather be called a composer." Never mind a woman composer, she was seeking universality. She was seeking the largest possible plane on which to have her music heard. She didn't want to be American as opposed to European. She wanted to be judged within the tradition of classical music.
For 77 years, Amy Marcy Cheney Beach brought music to the world. As a composer, her output included hymns, choral works, chamber music, piano pieces, a symphony, a piano concerto, a mass, an opera, and over 150 songs. As a performer, she played for audiences throughout the United States and Europe. As a teacher, she inspired and nurtured aspiring composers, young and old, male or female. And by just being herself, she redefined the role of women in music.
I don't ever get the feeling with her it was to prove a point. It was just to make music in the fullest possible way.
If the second movement leaves you a little bit somber, and then the third movement sort of brightens up, and it almost feels like a little, a little bit of that movement. I don't know. Sometimes we joke it almost feels a little bit like circus music at times. But then, classic Amy Beach, she'll switch, and all of a sudden you'll have this impassioned, octaves in the strings, and then switch back to the end, which is da da da. It's almost like a show tune. I hope that's okay, Mrs. Beach.
When you read a book, you write a book, you have 8 pages at the end or a dozen footnotes. And there are so many footnotes that could go with this that I could write a book about it. But a couple of them that I'll just share. One of them is, there was a lot of music in this documentary. And we did not have a huge budget to produce this. And all of the musicians donated their time to be in this documentary. We didn't write a check to any one of those people who played. And the way we found them were different ways. I was on Google Alerts, so I would get notes that some performance was happening of a beach piece, and I'd reach out to the Nev Trio was a perfect example. I heard that they had recorded the trio, but then I heard that they were playing it at a place down at Gordon College over here in Massachusetts. And I called them, and they said, sure, come on down. So I went down and recorded, and we did the interview, and that's the way it happened. We were so lucky that the Mercury Orchestra, just in that summer, decided to perform the Beach Symphony. That was just pure luck. And then other places we reached out, and I put the idea in people's heads, would you like to do this? And that was the case with the Concord High School Chorus. I said, you know, would you be interested in learning a piece by Beach? And they took it on and they did it. And the dancers, that was another one. I reached out to the dance school and said, would you be interested in learning a piece by Beach? And they did. So, but it's so important to just kind of share that those people all gave their time to help make this documentary, and I truly appreciated it.
There was a garden or a composting that allowed somebody like Beach to come along. But what really occurs to me, because I lived here for a major part of my life, I was married to a wonderful musician in the Boston Symphony, and I had the good fortune to come to this physical place as a very young woman. I would have been 23, and there was a wonderful librarian here, Lee Eisman's sort of predecessor, Mr. Sherman, and this was an all-male place. Women were not allowed in here. And for some reason, he took a shine to me and vice versa, and he allowed me to borrow many scores here. And he sort of turned me on to the whole Boston Classical School, because I grew up on a ranch in California. I was a hick. I went to London and studied with Myra Hess and Gina Bachauer, and then I came back and met my cellist husband in Marlborough and settled in Boston. And what a lucky thing for me. And I suppose when I watched John's film, and John, he doesn't like me to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. He has a genius, and every time I see the film, it touches me all over again. He rides the phrase, he rides the passion. And man, that woman she's like Edith Wharton. You know, they really understood sensuality, and yet it was all sort of facaded, and you know, you weren't supposed to let it all hang out. And this place had such an impact on me, and I got to perform here many times, and then I was very lucky, and in a way it was, I guess, my falling in love with her story. And of course I was taught the same way as a child. When I was 2, I wanted to play, and my mother painted the keys. She painted, it was like red, orange, yellow, green, purple. Because a 2-year-old, you cannot teach a 2-year-old nomenclature. A 2-year-old doesn't read. So I wanted to play. My father was a jazz musician. So she color-coded the piano, and then she color-coded the music. My mother, who was an editor and knew nothing about music. And so when I learned about Amy Beach having synesthesia, you know, ka-ching, a gong went off in my head, because to me the key of F is green, and with her it was purple, and John seemed to understand these absolutely wackadoodle things that had happened in this woman. And I'm born more or less when she dies. I never meet her, but I felt such a kindred spirit. And then being allowed to come in this physical building, learn about her and Foote and McDowell and and Payne and Loeffler, and then being married into the Boston Symphony family. You know, it's like being in the military. If you have a husband who's a general or something, you live large. It's very special. And then I played at the Gardner Museum, and the lady who ran the concerts, she didn't want to do it anymore. And so she'd give me like all the money for a month of concerts. So I pigged out. I said, a month of Beach, you know, a month of Foote. And then Northeastern Records was started, and I got hired, and they funded every crazy idea I had. But again, it was timing. And it was a time when Ms. Magazine was starting, and there was this huge appetite to look at what was endemically American, what was specifically special. And of course, now we know all about that, because that was happening in the 70s and the 80s. But I still feel, and now I'm an old lady, and I look back, my darling granddaughter is here from Iceland, my pilot's son is here, and things have changed. They're monumentally different, and there's a wonderful acceptance and a Me Too movement, and now the Boston Symphony has women conductors and women composers. What a wonderful thing for me to see unfold. And John sort of wrapped himself around all of these. He was very patient. We'd have these long luncheons, and I look back on it now, John, you're a saint, because I would rant and rave, and when I see the film, I get very upset, because I guess it's my impatient nature, and as a performer, so often I have to get on a stage and deal with a crappy piano and a crazy drunken conductor like Arthur Fiedler. Every time we were on stage, he was like falling down drunk. He was sober in the rehearsal, and then by 5 o'clock he was like, And one time at Pops, I'm playing along, and I suddenly realized, my God, my gown, there's something wrong. And Borak was concertmaster, and he reached over, he saw what was happening. My gown had come apart. You know how the top hook of the zipper? I hadn't done that. So the zipper's going, and it's falling off like that. And I realized, whoa, and I'm playing Rachmaninoff or something fast, and the zipper went back up like that, and it got tight again. It was, yes. Crazy things happen. I'm on stage, and I made the mistake of looking up once, and there's a huge rat. He's running across. I think, whoa, keep playing. Hope that rat doesn't drop down. The crap that happens, and John is not going to tell you, but when we started filming, he comes over to my house. He doesn't like the light because it's in the sun or something. So he says, we got to fix that. So what do we fix? I go out on a ladder in the cold with bed sheets on the top of my whole house. It's hard to get sheets to go on the top of a house. John says, no, we have to have that. And he doesn't, the other pianist, Joanne Polk, like, what was it like, John, 150-degree day in Manhattan. She had a makeup artist. John and I had never known musicians to have that. I was very impressed. And she was standing by, touch up and do the right thing. And all of a sudden, John says, got to get that air conditioning off. It's too loud. And she starts to play, and the makeup is all running. She's like, oh my God. So we have to break for the makeup artist to get it ready. Really, remember that day, John, that they opened up the road, and we're lugging the silk umbrella and his equipment, and we're walking over bridges like this, and if you misstep, you fall into a gulch and you die. The things that we put up with, and he put up with in particular, and they also, that night of they were supposed to play on the Esplanade, and do you remember we would have these epic rainstorms in the summertime? So they were moved inside to Jordan Hall, but I was actually luckier for you, because when you rolled camera, you could have more control than at the Esplanade, where you'd be out with the elements and the bugs and the bees and God knows what all. So it's a wonderful film, and it has many aspects that I feel are so specifically Boston and so touching as a woman who overcame a rather dreadful childhood. Imagine not letting a child play the piano. None of us, if we had a child who wanted to go and play the piano, you wouldn't say, no, you can't do that. It would be just unheard of. So she's a triumph, a tragedy into a triumph. And then the husband dies, and she makes a wonderful life and a lesson for no matter where you're born, make the best of it. And I am convinced that where you're born and where you grow up, it has profound ramifications. And now I teach at a college up there in Keene, which is like 20 minutes from where she grew up. And I still believe in that. I still believe in the idea that you have to be very careful with young people, because you don't really know what's going down with them. But look at her. What a wonderful gift that she was, in a way. So, any other questions you want to ask?
Give her a second, and she'll take it over. Any questions or comments? Yeah, question. Go for it.
I guess for both of you, or primarily for you, are there extant recordings of her playing? And
I looked really hard for that, and I could find no recordings or even any film. She died in 1944. You would think there was a film someplace of her, but I was not able to locate it.
Surprising. She should have gone to New Jersey.
There are references to her being on radio stations, but the radios wouldn't record. It would be live. And, what were the chances that the predecessor to WQXR in New York 70, 80, 90 years ago saved what they were recording? It just didn't happen. So, yes, but we did look around. So the biggest challenge for this actually was it was about sharing her music so that people that came would know more of her music. and also to kind of give a little bit of musical explanation, how this music is put together, and also focus on that political side of the difficulties of being a woman at that moment in time. And that was the fun part of it, actually, putting it. And we really, there's a lot more music in here than you would normally hear in a documentary. I felt it was appropriate. Sometimes I say, well, I hope people aren't getting their watches or anything, but the music is what this is all about, and the story goes with it. I would say, and this is another thing, this idea of the firsts of Amy Beach. And, it's never said, that's never written in the script. This was the first symphony, this was the first concerto. Well, one of those notions that I had was, she played in the 4th season of the Boston Symphony for the first time, and I thought she must have been the first woman to play with the Boston Symphony. She was the 7th pianist to solo with the Boston Symphony Orchestra. So in the first 4 years of the Boston Symphony, they really went through a number of women soloists, which I was surprised at. Anyway, any other questions, comments? Thank you for enjoying. This is the first time we've shown this in Boston.
Yep, and I would just add that the plaque that John films on her house at 28 Com Ave was designed by Khalil Gibran, my neighbor in the South End, and if you're it's on the Women's Heritage Trail. If you're walking up, it's right there on the house.
Should we ask Virginia to play one short piece by piece?
No.
Oh, come on, Virginia, you did it.
No, it's too much. One short piece. No. Thank you so much for coming.
All right. We have copies of them for sale if anybody's interested. They're $15. I have to get them out, but we do have them. Thank you.